Ready? We're here at the Nullification Tour in Manchester, New Hampshire, March 19th, 2011, and next to me is someone who's become almost a household name in the freedom movement, Tom Woods, Professor Tom Woods. Tom and I go back to his days at Harvard in the early 90s when you had an off-campus, an underground conservative newspaper. I think I remembered putting ads in there and writing a few pieces. But since then, you've come a long way. And you are a Boston, greater Boston native. And so tell us a little bit about some of the things you've been doing since your Harvard days and some of your more recent books.
Well, I've been writing like a fiend. I've got this book number 11 came out this year, which, people say, how do you write so many books? Well, when you have no social life, you're amazed how many can accomplish.
You do have a very lovely wife, though, right? So she
true.
must be very supportive, or you would be able to do that.
That's right, and I dedicate a lot of them to her. But the big thing was 2004, I had a book called The Politically Incorrect Guide to American History. And I didn't come up with that brilliant title. And people, I think, all they needed to hear was the title. And they said, all right, I need to know what's in this book. So that book sold like crazy. New York Times bestseller. Yeah, 12 weeks, did really well. And then after that, I've had a bunch of other titles, the most recent of which are Nullification, the subject of our meeting today, and the most recent one, called Rollback, is not just about rolling back Obama. I wish that were our only problem.
Right.
Then it might be doable.
He's a symptom of the problem.
He's a symptom of the problem.
Talk about nullification. The Constitution is a wonderful document, and most people, they love the Constitution. Well, tell me something about it, and it would sort of end there. And when we had a Bill of Rights, each amendment was in itself a significant part of that Bill of Rights. But the 10th Amendment is something people would say, oh, that old thing, that's something that's obsolete. So tell us about the 10th Amendment. Tell us about how that can be used to roll back some of those unconstitutional things that are happening in Congress.
Sure. Well, the 10th Amendment, which is supposed to keep all powers that were not delegated by the states in the Constitution at the state level or with the people. This is an amendment that, obviously the federal government is not going to enforce this thing. That's what we're starting to learn, is that we have to do the enforcing.
The Constitution is not self-enforcing.
Exactly. The states have to do the enforcing. The Constitution does not grow fangs if you violate it. And so...
the fangs would be quite long by now.
Exactly, that's right. So if you look at the ratifying conventions, which is where Madison says you need to look if you want to know what the Constitution really means, what were people sold when they accepted this document? You see, repeatedly, they were sold the idea that even before the 10th Amendment was instituted, still it was taken for granted that implicitly in the Constitution already was this principle, that the federal government has only the powers that are expressly delegated, and they even used the word expressly in a lot of these conventions. So that's what people went into the Constitution expecting. And of course, it's not what they wound up getting. With some honorable exceptions, by and large, this is not what they wound up getting. So what Jefferson concluded from this, and people who followed him concluded from this, was that if the federal government does violate the 10th Amendment, then the aggrieved party, namely the states, need to stand up and say, well, you can't do this. Like, we all know you're not entitled to do this. So if you do something unconstitutional, we have to refuse to enforce it. And for people who say, but wait a minute, what about the courts? Aren't they supposed to make these decisions? Madison wrote in his famous report of 1800 that, you know what, it's not just that we have fallible presidents and fallible congressmen. We also have fallible judges.
That's right.
We can't believe that these people are demigods. So in other words, his view was that given that the states were the parties to the Constitution, they created the thing. In the last resort, when everything else has failed, they as the creators have to say, wait a minute, we created the thing and we never intended this entity to have the powers it's exercising. That's just the nature of the setup with the creators and their relationship with the created thing, is that they have to be in the driver's seat. Yeah. This is not what you learn in law school.
What happens is that this federal government has basically bribed the states with billions and billions of the money from the states to begin with, the taxpayer. So they'll say, well, if you don't do this, you don't get this big chunk of change. Raise your speed limits, lower your speed limits, implement this federal educational program in your schools, and we'll plop a lot of money, but with money comes control.
Right.
Now, in your book, Nullification, which I read when it first came out, it talked about some of the early times when the 10th Amendment was used, and some more recent times. And people on the left will say, oh, this is a right-wing thing. But wasn't it the Dred Scott decision and the fugitives, wasn't that nullified in some states?
Well, first of all, we should remember that Abraham Lincoln was of the view that the Dred Scott decision should not be enforced because it was unconstitutional. Well, isn't that something?
That's
Right, Abraham Lincoln. When are we going to get some anti-Lincoln protests from these people? I don't think that's going to happen. But then, that's right, the idea of nullification, people assume it must have had something to do with slavery because we all know that anything involving the states must be for evil.
Right, exactly, yes,
But
yeah.
this is not the case, because for one thing, just think common sense. What anti-slavery federal laws would the southern states have needed to nullify? There weren't any. So why would they be using nullification?
That's right, yeah.
But to the contrary, it was the northern states, and particularly Wisconsin, where they used the idea, they quoted Jefferson saying nullification is the rightful remedy against the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which they believed that even though there's a fugitive slave clause, well, there are a lot of clauses in the Constitution. That doesn't mean absolutely any imposition can be made on the people to enforce that. So they believe that on balance that thing was unconstitutional, and in this state we're going to protect people
Is
against
that clause in Article 4 of the Constitution?
Section 2, I think. Yes, I think that's where it is.
We're dealing with state religion,
Yeah.
each federal state. And some more recent nullification. Now, of course, there's a big movement to nullify Obamacare, and that's happened in, I think, Idaho. I don't know if it's been signed yet, but it's in the process of being, I think both houses have
Yeah.
agreed to it. But the Real ID Act.
Yeah, that's an example of how it can practically work. That you had fiscal conservatives, civil libertarians, all up in arms with the Real ID Act. You had a couple of dozen states refusing to comply.
Including this one, New Hampshire.
And then Janet that's good to know. I should expect that. And then Janet Napolitano even admitted. She said, you know, the reason we had to back off on that was that the states wouldn't go along with it. Well, there you go. So the question is, well, can the states do this? It's not really that. That's not really the question, because we could just as easily say, when presented with the U.S. Constitution, can the federal government impose blah, blah, blah on the people? Well, according to this document, it can't.
Right.
But it does anyway, and it gets away with it. Now, nullification is different because from the Jeffersonian point of view, it is a constitutional remedy. The question is, can we do it? Well, again, can we get away with it? A lot of states do it, and we change enough minds so that this seems like a common sense approach. It can be done. And I included in nullification here an interesting
Hold the
poll.
book up, because we want people to buy this.
There it is.
Don't be
there.
bashful about a book like this. It needs to be read and understood.
You can check this out. I actually did a resource page, like answering questions and objections
Good.
at statenullification.com. You can read more about this. But in here, I put I guess people like that website. I put in here a poll from a year or two ago showing that almost 3/5 of the public believes that states should have some kind of opt-out clause from federal programs. And that's without even hearing any of these arguments. There's already a kind of sense that, well, even though this isn't exactly the same thing as nullification, something that might work for Maine wouldn't work for Texas.
It's like some folks, the unions say, we want to opt out of Obamacare.
Yeah.
We supported you, we pushed the program, and now all of a sudden, wait a minute now, it doesn't look like it's going to benefit us.
Right.
And they'll say, okay, we'll get you out of it.
Right, so that, if what's good for the goose, so that's good to see. There is this sort of fundamental inchoate sense among the public that this makes sense even without hearing the arguments for it. And the arguments for it are much stronger than I thought they were before I wrote this.
That's excellent. Now, where can people get Amazon?
Amazon and
almost anywhere, right?
Yeah,
Bookstores?
I've got on my website, tomwoods.com, I've got a free chapter of this and a free chapter of Rollback, which is basically about why it's not enough to cut the budget, which hard enough as that would be. We have to cut the propaganda that leads people to support these budgets, that makes them think, oh gosh, the poor would be dying in the streets, and no one would have health, and the arts would disappear, there'd be no science, whatever. No, I mean, that's what we're
Just the opposite.
Exactly, it's just the opposite.
Yeah.
And of course, if I had a racket like this going, like the U.S. government, where I'm taxing people like crazy, running up all these debts, print my own money, I would want everyone to believe this is for your own good. Where would you be without me? This is taking a machete and a sledgehammer simultaneously to all this propaganda we've got.
Well, thank you so much for
the
interview, and we'll hopefully get it wide and far. And so thanks, folks, for watching. And please get a copy of this book, tomwoods.com. And you're still with the Von Mises Foundation, too?
Yes, I am.
Von Mises
Senior
Foundation. So vonmises.com.
Mises.org, M-I-S-E-S.
So, ex-organization. And, of course, the person doing this interview, John Birch Society, JPS.org. Thank you.